Good evening. This is Monica with Cross to Cross Conversations, and this is The Reckoning is Here, a 7-part series discussing Black History Month. I do need to give you a content warning. This episode discusses extreme racial violence, lynching, terrorism, legal oppression, and ongoing systemic racism. This is one of the hardest episodes in the series, in a way they all were. So if you need to pause, please do so. Your self care as well as your mental health is first and foremost. So, the last episode, we talked about the massacres. So, we talked about Colfax in 1873, Wilmington in 1898. We spoke about Elaine in 1919, Tulsa in 1921, and Rosewood 1923, and then finally what happened in Charleston in 2025. We talked about the pattern that whenever black people gained power, whether it was political, economic, or social, then white supremacy responded with violence, and the legal system protected the perpetrators. There was no accountability, no justice, no healing. So today we're going to trace how that violence was codified into law. We're going from 1877 all the way into present day 2026. We're going to talk about Jim Crow as America apartheid. We're going to talk about lynching as terrorism. We're going to talk about the legal system that seems to enable a lot of this. We're then going to talk about the civil rights movement, mass incarceration. We're going to touch on George Floyd just a little bit, and then why Mississippi didn't ratify the 13th Amendment until 2013. So by the end of this episode, you'll understand why this isn't just ancient history. You'll understand why the systems created during Jim Crow are still operating today. And you'll understand why I say the reckoning is here. So, what was Jim Crow? So, Jim Crow was American apartheid. So, for 88 years, from 1877 to 1965, the South operated under a system of legal racial segregation and oppression. So, everything was separate. You're talking about schools, restaurants, hotels, theaters, water fountains, restrooms, buses and trains, parks and beaches, hospital, cemeteries. Everything was separate. It was never equal. So black schools got the oldest textbooks, the worst buildings. There was no heat, no supplies. Black neighborhoods got no paving, no street lights, no sewers. Black people were shut out of good jobs. They were kept in poverty and denied every opportunity for advancement. And this was by design. So Jim Crow wasn't just custom or tradition, it was actually law. Let me read you some of the laws from some states that I found rather interesting. So in Alabama, it stated, it shall be unlawful for a Negro and white person to play together or in company with each other in any game of cards or dice, dominoes, or checkers. That was a law. In Florida, one of Florida's laws stated the schools for white children and the schools for Negro children shall be conducted separately. Georgia, all persons licensed to conduct a restaurant shall serve either white people exclusively or colored people exclusively. Mississippi, separate free schools shall be established for the education of children of African descent, and it shall be unlawful for any colored child to attend any white school or any white child to attend a colored school. And then finally, the last one I want to mention was one that was written in North Carolina that said, books shall not be interchangeable between the white and colored schools, but shall continue to be used by the race first using them. So even textbooks couldn't be shared. But Jim Crow wasn't just about laws. It was about enforcing black inferiority in every interaction. So black people were expected to step off the sidewalk when a white person approached, never look a white person directly in the eye, always use sir and ma'am when addressing white people who would actually call black adults by their first names or boy or girl. Black people weren't allowed to enter into white homes and businesses through the front door. They always had to go through the back door. A black person could never contradict a white person. They could never shake hands with a white person as equals. In violation of these rules could get you beaten, arrested, or killed. So Jim Crow was enforced through terror. If black people tried to vote, then there was violence. If black people owned successful businesses, there was violence. If black people challenged segregation, there was violence. And if a black person was accused of even looking at a white woman, there was violence. And as I said earlier, the law protected the perpetrators. There were always all white juries, all white police forces, and all white judges. So there was no justice. In 1892, Homer Plessy, a black man in Louisiana, sat in a whites-only rail car. He was arrested for violating Louisiana's Separate Car Act. Plessy sued, and he argued that segregation violated the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection under the law. The case went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court in May 18th of 1896, they ruled 7-1 against Plessy. So Justice Henry Billings Brown wrote the majority opinion. He said that there was going to be separate but equal. He said it was constitutional. As long as the facilities are equal, of course they never were, segregation is considered legal. So the court said if one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane. So what does that translate to? The law can't fix racial inequality, so segregation is fine. So Plessy v. Ferguson made Jim Crow legal nationwide. It gave legal blessing to segregation for the next approximately 58 years until it was finally overturned by Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. So for 58 years, it was legalized apartheid. 2 generations of black children educated in inferior schools. 2 generations of black people denied the opportunity, wealth, and dignity. And all of this was all legal. And so there was a film in 1915 by D.W. Griffith, he released a film called The Birth of a Nation. It was a blockbuster hit back then. It was 3 hours long. It was revolutionary cinematography. It was screened at the White House for President Woodrow Wilson. And it was all white supremacist propaganda. The film portrayed black people, often played by white characters in blackface. It presented black people as violent, lazy, and sexually dangerous. The Ku Klux Klan, it presented them as heroes saving white civilization. It said that Reconstruction was a disaster caused by giving black people rights and that white supremacy was noble and necessary. The climax of the film is the KKK riding in to save white people from black people. The Birth of the Nation revived the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan had largely faded after Reconstruction, but this film brought it right back. So by the 1920s, the Klan had millions of members, not just in the South, but in the North, the Midwest, and the West. It held, the KKK held parades in Washington, D.C. They controlled local governments, and they terrorized black communities with impunity. A movie did that. So propaganda actually works. So we're going to talk about lynching in a minute. Right now, I'm actually going to just telling you about what we're moving to next, just to give you some pause, give you time. If you don't want to listen to that section, I certainly understand. So lynching is extrajudicial murder. Basically, it was killing without trial or legal process. So during Jim Crow, lynching was used as terrorism to enforce white supremacy. So between 1877 and 1950, at least 4,400 black people were lynched in the United States. And of course, that's 4,400 documented cases. The actual number is probably likely much higher because many lynchings were never recorded. And, there were several reasons why a person could be lynched, but sometimes it could have been as simple as a person was accused. It could have been an accusation that was often false. So, a prime example that I know most of you have probably heard is Emmett Till in 1955. He was a 14-year-old boy. He was tortured and murdered in Mississippi for allegedly whistling at a white woman. His killers were acquitted, and they later admitted to the murder in a magazine interview, but often there was no accusation at all when it came to lynching. Black people were lynched for being too successful, owning land white people wanted, disrespecting, I'm using air quotes, a white person, trying to vote, defending themselves. There was basically no reason at all. So many lynchings were just public events. There were white crowds of men, women, and children gathered to watch. They took photographs, they kept body parts as souvenirs, they sent postcards of lynchings throughout. They sent post lynchings, the pictures of the lynchings, through the U.S. mail, but that's how those pictures went throughout the U.S. So these were not hidden acts of violence. They were public displays of terror, and there was no justice. Almost no one was ever prosecuted for lynching. There were all white juries that that refused to convict. Local law enforcement was often participated in it, and the federal government did nothing. So for decades, Congress refused to pass anti-lynching legislation. Even when black communities begged for protection, the government turned away. So lynching wasn't just about punishing individuals, it was about terrorizing an entire population of people. And the message that they were trying to send was stay in your place, don't challenge us, or this will be you. And, unfortunately it worked. Black people lived in constant fear. Sorry, my mouth is turning dry again. Can't even pronounce my words. So do you remember when we briefly discussed the 13th Amendment? There was a part of the 13th Amendment that I read that said neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for law. And so this is the 13th Amendment was the one that abolished slavery, and it said that it was abolishing slavery, but it had an exception. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime. And that exception became a new form of slavery. So let me explain how that worked a little bit. So after the Civil War, Southern states passed what they called black codes. These were laws designed to criminalize black life. So vagrancy, loitering, insulting gestures, changing jobs without permission. Black people were arrested on these charges, often completely fabricated. They weren't true. But once convicted, they were leased to private companies. So they were leased to companies that were involved with like coal mining, turpentine camps, lumber mills, railroads, plantations. So they did the same work they did under slavery. And the conditions of convict leasing was actually often worse than slavery. Under slavery, enslavers had a financial incentive to keep the people alive because they were considered their property. But leased convicts, the people felt that they were disposable. So companies literally worked them to death. So death rates in some convict leasing operations exceeded 40%. So people died, they actually died at the rate of approximately 40%. And so these people died from exhaustion, disease, beatings, and quote unquote accidents. And their bodies were dumped in unmarked graves. And so companies were making millions from this. States made money leasing prisoners, and black people were re-enslaved by the thousands. And this continued into the 1940s. So slavery didn't actually end, it evolved. So let's talk about what I mentioned a little bit earlier Brown v. Board of Education. And so by the 1950s, the NAACP had been fighting segregation in the courts for decades. In 1954, they brought a case challenging school segregation, and that case became known as Brown v. Board of Education. The lead attorney was Thurgood Marshall, who would later become the first black Supreme Court justice. And so on May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously, and this is what they said: separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. So Plessy v. Ferguson, that I also mentioned earlier, was overturned. So school segregation was finally considered unconstitutional. So this was it was an entire victory for black people. But of course, there was resistance. Southern states refused to comply. And so massive resistance became the strategy: delay, defy, and fight integration at every turn. Schools closed rather than integrate. White parents pulled children out of public schools and created private segregation academies. Governors defied federal court orders. It took years and federal troops to enforce desegregation in some places, and even then it was incomplete. And today, many American schools are more segregated than they were in 1970 due to housing patterns, white flight, and school district boundaries. Pause and think on that for a moment. Although segregation is illegal, if you look at the school systems today and how the boundaries are, segregation is still a thing. And so we're going to talk about the civil rights movement really quick that took place from the 1950s to the 1960s. It was a fight for freedom. We don't have time to cover the entire civil rights movement in this episode, but I just want to give you some highlights. We heard in 1955 about the Montgomery bus boycott. 1960, we heard about the Greensboro sit-in, where 4 college students sat at a lunch counter when they weren't supposed to. Heard about the Freedom Rides in 1961. It was testing the segregation of interstate travel. In 1963, the Birmingham campaign, where Dr. King was arrested, and he writes, "Letter from Birmingham Jail." In 1963, there was the March on Washington. It was 250,000 people that attended, and that's where Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech. In 1964 was considered Freedom Summer. There was voter registration in Mississippi. In 1965, the Walk from Selma to Montgomery marches, also known as Bloody Sunday. And throughout the civil, And throughout the civil rights movement, you heard of the beatings, the bombings, the arrests, the assassinations. But then there were some victories as well. You heard of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This banned discrimination in public accommodations and employment. And then there was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which eliminated the literacy test and poll taxes, and it provided federal oversight at the elections. There were massive achievements, but of course they came at a cost, right? So Medgar Evers, NAACP field secretary, he was assassinated in 1963. I'm sure you heard about the 4 little girls that people often talk about who were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham in 1963. Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, 3 civil rights workers, were murdered in Mississippi in 1964. You know, Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965. Dr. King was assassinated in 1968. And there was countless others we've read about and spoken about that were beaten, jailed, terrorized. And what changed as a result of all of this that was going on, the victories and everything? The civil rights movement legally ended Jim Crow. But, of course, it didn't end racism. It didn't end poverty. It didn't end inequality because the systems were still in place. And so I'm sure you heard about what is titled the new Jim Crow, mass incarceration. So remember the 13th Amendment, there was also that exception in there. They said except as punishment for crime. So slavery was abolished, but except as punishment for crime. And in the 1980s and 1990s, America launched the war on drugs. So there was mandatory minimum sentences. That's where the three-strike rule came about. Crack versus powder cocaine. There was disparities in the sentencing. The ratio check was 100 to 1. Crack, that was used more in the black communities, and it carried a far harsher sentence. So you're talking about crack versus powder cocaine, which was predominantly used in white communities. So the sentencing was a bit different. And in 1980, about 500,000 people were incarcerated in the U.S. By 2010, it was 2.3 million. The U.S. has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. And black people are incarcerated at five times the rate of white people. Think about that. How is this the new Jim Crow? The disenfranchisement. In many states, people with felony convictions can't vote. Millions of black people are locked out of democracy. It basically legalizes discrimination. People with criminal records can be legally denied housing, employment, education, and public benefits. It's forced labor because prisoners work for pennies per hour, and the corporations profit off of that. And then just like slavery, there's family separation. Parents separated, husbands separated from wives, wives may be separated from their children, husbands separated from their family. It has generational impact. Children growing up with incarcerated parents. And so Michelle Alexander, she actually wrote a book about this, and she called it the new Jim Crow. The argument in her book was that mass incarceration is the continuation of the same system, and she's referring to the system of Jim Crow with the laws that they had. And what was the same system? What did that consist of? Control, exploit, and disenfranchise. It never stopped. It just changed forms. So, again, we spoke about this in the last episode briefly. But on May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was murdered by a Minneapolis police officer, and his name was Derek Chauvin. George Floyd was a 46-year-old man, and he was accused of using a counterfeit $20 bill at a convenience store. And so, of course, it's illegal to use a $20 counterfeit bill. No one is trying to justify. Because of that, the police were called, and that's when Officer Chauvin arrived. And for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, Derek Chauvin kept his knee on George Floyd's neck. And the entire thing was filmed, and the world watched. And watched as George Floyd said he can't breathe. But the officer didn't move, even though they begged Derek Chauvin to stop. But he didn't. And George Floyd died on the street, on the camera. 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And again, me speaking about this doesn't tell you where I stand, and please don't assume. I am just giving the facts of the case. We know that protests, because of the video of what happened, it went viral. We know that protests erupted in all 50 states, and over 26 million people took to the streets. It was the largest civil rights movement, what some people called as a civil rights movement, I should say, in U.S. history. And people of every race, every background, you found that they were marching together. They wanted you to say his name. They were shouting no justice, no peace. Cities burned to the ground. Statues of Confederate generals were torn down. And corporations scrambled to remove racist imagery. So you're talking about Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben's, Cream of Wheat. They all announced they were rebranding. So, after over 100 years of defending those images, suddenly, out of the blue, in the summer of 2020, they all changed. But did they change because they were saying that slavery was wrong? No. They changed because the pressure was too great for them to ignore. And for a brief moment, there was a reckoning. For a moment, it seemed like America was going to finally face itself. So some people titled it in 2020 a racial reckoning. So it forced a conversation. And so I can even attest to the conversation at the job I worked at the time. We had several conversations, and managers were required to speak with their people, especially the higher up managers. And at the time, my manager was a white woman, and I could tell she was very uncomfortable with talking to me. And for me, my opinion, my own personal opinion, when you're forced to have a conversation, when you're required to have a conversation, it doesn't mean the same thing. It has no meaning to it. So, what I proceeded to tell her is she doesn't need to have the conversation with me. And in fact, it is an insult because she wasn't doing it from a place of her heart, from understanding of, I'm not saying now, I don't believe she wasn't racist. That's not what I'm saying. Please don't do that at all. But it was an uncomfortable conversation that she was required to do because of her level of management she was in at the time. It wasn't going to do anything for me but waste time on the phone. So I proceeded to tell her she does not have to proceed with the conversation. And so we hung up the phone. She respected me. I respected her. We moved on. And our relationship remained the same. It didn't become different. It didn't become uncomfortable. It just remained the same. Why? Because I don't believe in forcing people to have a conversation that they don't really know how to have. She didn't know how to have this conversation. Oh, one thing I did mention, she did ask me how should she have the conversation with the others. Now, I did appreciate that because what she did was she was vulnerable enough to say she cannot relate and she doesn't know how to have this conversation. And I did appreciate that. And this is what I told her. I told her, don't speak on the talking points that she was given and that she's just reading the talking points. What I told her to do was speak from her heart, whatever comes to her heart. And I didn't follow up with her to see how those conversations went. I don't know if she took my advice. I will say I didn't hear any backlash about it. But there you go. So what happened after these forced conversations? Some conversations, absolutely, they needed to be held. Absolutely. But what happened? So Derek Chauvin was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to 22 and a half years in prison. And so that's justice for one case, just one case. But what about the system? What about all of the other people whose murders maybe weren't filmed? What about the people who's being shot in their home? We just learned of a conviction a couple of weeks ago about a police officer who shot a woman in her home because he said he believed she was going to throw a pot of hot water on him. What about people who are hunted down while jogging? Sure, there was some restitution there as well. What about other people who have said they can't breathe? What about young boys being shot within seconds of police arrival? I can add more and more to that list. And some of you may be listening saying she's making things up. But some of you know exactly what I'm saying. Some of you know absolutely what I am saying. So what changed during this time of George Floyd? What changed? So we had some police departments, they added training. Some cities reduced police budgets. Some corporations donated to racial justice causes. But the foundation didn't change. Sure, the protests faded. The news cycle, it moved on to the next thing. And the brands changed their logos. But America didn't repent. They simply rebranded. America did not repent. It simply rebranded. And so in 2013, the last one, here's something most people don't know. Mississippi didn't officially ratify the 13th Amendment until 2013. Let that sit in your brain for a moment. The state of Mississippi didn't ratify the amendment abolishing slavery until 2013. 13 years ago. They were 148 years late. And what happened that Mississippi finally ratified? So technically, though, I'm going to be honest here. Technically, Mississippi state legislature, they voted to ratify it in 1995. Still late though, right? 1995. But they never filed the paperwork with the U.S. Archivist. So it didn't become official. And it was in 2013, a professor saw the movie called Lynching and wondered about Mississippi. So he looked it up and he discovered that Mississippi had never officially ratified. So he contacted state officials. And finally, in February of 2013, Mississippi filed the paperwork. 148 years after the amendment passed. This wasn't just bureaucratic oversight. This was symbolic. Mississippi, the state with the highest percentage of black residents, refused to officially acknowledge that slavery should be abolished. And they refused to acknowledge that for 148 years, even when it was already the law of the land, even when it meant nothing legally. They still refuse because the spirit of slavery never left. And so what is our current reality? Let's look where we are in 2026. There's a wealth gap. The median white family has 10 times the wealth of the median black family. This is the result of 400 years of stolen labor, blocked opportunity, and legal discrimination. We still have school segregation because many schools are more segregated now than it was in 1970. And that's just based on, how the schools are set up. Where the dividing line is. There's housing segregation. Redlining effects still persist. Black families are denied mortgages at higher rates than any other race. There are health disparities. Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. There's police violence that we read about. We read about black people are killed by police at approximately 2.5 times the rate of white people. They're trying to implement new laws that would suppress voters, new laws restricting voting access, and that affect black communities. So there were systems created during slavery and Jim Crow that are still operating. And now in 2026, America is more divided than it's been probably since the Civil War. It's divided politically. There's armed militias. There's violence. Look at what happens at the polls. People are asking, is another civil war coming? And yes, you should ask yourself that. Is America collapsing? One of the things that you have to understand with all of this is that this is the reckoning. Don't be deceived. God is not mocked. A man will reap what he sows. So you may ask, well, what is it that America has sown? Let me ask you, what has America sown? Let's go over it. We had 246 years of slavery, 88 years of Jim Crow, decades of mass incarceration that still goes on, right? 400 plus years of violence, theft, and oppression. So, what do you think America is reaping right now? Division, violence, collapse of trust. There's fear of another civil war approaching. And there's this sense that everything is falling apart. So this is the harvest of what happened back then. America has never paid its debt. There was no accountability, no acknowledgement of the full truth. So there was just denial, deflection, and demands that we move on. But you can't move on from what what you haven't faced. You can't heal what you won't acknowledge. I said that in almost every episode. You can't heal what you won't acknowledge. You cannot leave this world behind when the sins of this world are still operating and the debt is due. America is about to find out what happens when you refuse to pay. And so I want to make it clear that I am not talking about the victim mentality here. I'm just giving you history. And hopefully this prompted you to have the conversation with your children. Have that discussion about why this isn't taught, why this isn't being taught in our schools, even in our colleges. I told you that there are some books there's one book that I purchased, and there are some other books that I have in my cart that I plan to purchase, because I want to see what our schools are teaching today. I want to come from a place of knowledge instead of a place of ignorance. So when I talk about this, I know and I can give examples of what's being taught in books and how they try to sanitize it. I'm not saying this to get anybody upset. I'm not trying to cause toxic relationships between cultures, between ethnicities. That's not what the point is here. This is Black History Month, and I am simply giving you some history. This is a 7-part series. This is episode 6. In the final episode, I'm going to tie all of this together. And I'm going to show you the prophetic warning America refuses to hear. And that is the reckoning is here. So episode 7 is the finale. And everything we've covered in all 6 episodes, I'm going to tie those together. So this is Monica with Cross to Cross Conversations. Thank you for listening.